Here's my game of the day from round 6 of the Sharjah Masters, and it features Rasmus Svane playing white, who is, well, very, very talented German junior player. And he faces Adhiban Baskaran from India, who is really rising through the ranks at the moment. And I want to look at this game, well, just when they reach an end game. Svane with white now played queen f3, because I think if he leaves the queens on, then black can play moves like bishop c5. And white's king is very boxed in the corner, so I think it's very understandable that he wanted to exchange queens here. So Adhiban duly traded, and we have a fascinating endgame to come. Well, the first thing is, you can see it's a bishop against a knight, and at the moment it's not clear which minor piece is going to be stronger. If this knight could position itself on a good square like f5, then white could be better, but it's black's move here, and that gives black time to well, first of all, play this move, this incredibly important move, h3. And after this, it's quite clear that black has the advantage, because this pawn is a permanent weakness now. And, well, the big question is, can black break through with the king? So first of all, knight e2. So that covers this entry square here, and threatens to play knight g1, taking the pawn. So the king advances. And now if knight g1, well, you don't even need to play king h4. Then black can simply play king f4 and enter with the king, and that's winning for black. So it's very important that for the moment that knight remains on e2, covering the f4 square, preventing black's king from entering into the position. Now there is a danger here that white's king could be blocked in with bishop c5, and the position would be Zugzwang actually. Eventually the knight would have to move, and then the king enters into the position via f4. So very important that the king steps out of the corner. So check, and bishop e3. So black has made progress over the last couple of moves. That's quite clear. This bishop would very much like to go to f4 to hit the h2 pawn. White is running really short of moves here. I mean, for the moment, white just has to wait. So king e1. Now, if bishop f4, this would be a huge mistake. Of course, black would love to take that pawn, but the king and pawn endgame is, well, probably winning for white. Eventually, black's king is going to have to go back, then king e3, and you can force f4. Not a good idea. So, well, big question for black is, how are you going to break this blockade? Can't get through on the king side, but there is a route through to the queen side for this king, and Adhiban prepared the way with a5. Now white has a real dilemma here. He can see that the king is on its way, but how should he position his queenside pawns? Can he create a fortress? Can he blockade, create a successful blockade and keep black's king out? Svane played a4. He could have played b3, and it's very hard to know which is best. In any case, after b3, the king would perform the same journey and head for a3. And then try and break through. But he selected a4. As I said, very hard to know whether b3 would have offered salvation. but black would carry out the same plan. And now before the king takes a trip, h4, preventing the knight coming to g3, but also, well, we'll see later, it sets up a little tactic that is very, very important if black is going to make progress. So white just has to sit there for the time being, and now the king shuffles over to the queen's side. Of course, black always has to be aware of this move f4, and now we can see the tactic. Bishop g3, and this will, well, this wins very easily because this pawn is dropping. Obviously, if the bishop is taken, then the h pawn rolls through. So that's very important. That's why, well, one of the reasons why the pawn moved to h4. So white comes across with the king, black comes across. So white is still trying to block out black's king. And once again, f4 just doesn't work because of bishop g3. You can take the h pawn, but that's a winning position. So white waits, has to allow the king into b4. So black has made considerable progress. The king has entered to some extent on the queen side. There's this pawn on the king side which is weak, and now Adhiban goes for it with this trick, bishop g3. So obviously that can't be taken, the h pawn goes through again. So white has only one possibility, and that's to play knight g1 and to take the pawn on h3. But this is progress for black, of course, because yes, the h pawn is blockaded, but it means the knight is permanently stuck on h3, and the bishop is still free to maneuver, and that's very important. So white can only wait. So knight g5 here, and bishop e3. So this is a very familiar theme with endings, in endings where the bishop plays against the knight, that you can see the knight is completely dominated by the bishop. So that means that white is running short of moves. He has to just move the king. But at the moment the king is blocked out. So how does black make progress here? Well, I mean, on the last turn, of course, it's possible for black to come in with king a3, but before doing that, Adhiban wanted to clear up the pawns. If black could try to enter with the king on a3, with all the pawns on the board, it would have given white additional sources of counterplay. But this pawn move b5 just kind of clears up the situation. It's a very good move. And because of the situation with the knight on h3, then black is always going to be able to force the king back. Like this. So, although the knight has its freedom again, in fact, with a little bit of shuffling, black can drive back the king, and now black's king comes into b4. And, well, actually again we want the bishop back on e3. So little by little Adhiban is making progress here. That can't be taken. Let's have a little look. Knight takes. The king can take care of the e pawn, and the h pawn goes through. So knight f2. And now, well, black needs this position to be with white to move. At the moment it's black to move, but a little bit of shuffling and you can get there. So for example, if knight h3, then bishop e3, and this will transpose to the game. So with white play, that's obviously Zugzwang. Instead of that, knight d3 check, but it comes to the same thing. here, and now king b4. So that's our ideal position. We finally got there. Black could get that by force. So you can see again the knight is trapped, and white's king has to make room, has to give ground. So for example, if king a2, then the king comes in and can go all the way towards the king side. King c2 is, well, more tenacious, but this is still winning for black. So the king comes in, and white tries to keep the king blocked out, but it's going to be Zugzwang again. So black needs this position with white to move. At the moment it's black to move, and you can do that by shuffling with the bishop. And white has no alternative here, and bishop e3. So there we are. Same position, but this time it's white to move. So white has to give ground. Now if the king goes to d3, then we just take, and the a-pawn goes through. Obviously the knight is tied up, blockading the h-pawn. So here white played king c3, and now, well, perhaps Adhiban was just gaining time on the clock. You get 30 seconds added each time you make a move, and now, having repeated, he then brought the king into b1. So the king has made a very long journey, this odyssey, right round the board, right round here, and now it would like to come all the way back to the king side to hassle the knight and force the h-pawn through. That's the basic idea. Bishop goes back. Now if king c3, then the king will continue on its journey as advertised, and this is completely winning. The king will get to the knight. So Svane thought, well, it's time to try and complicate at the very least, so he finally broke with f4. It's possible to play bishop takes, actually. It would reach a queen and pawn endgame, which should be winning, for example, after this. Well, both sides will queen, white, black will be a pawn up. I don't want to get into that. It's winning for black, but I think Adhiban selected the kind of principled move, which was to keep the bishop. Now it looks, for them, just for a moment, slightly scary, but actually the bishop controls e7 and still has freedom to hassle the king and knight, and well, again, it just shows the long-range power of the bishop here. Check, and a4, and this is the problem. Of course, white can push on and win the piece, but the knight can't get back to stop the a-pawn. So knight e5, bishop came back to e7, everything securely protected, and now it's just impossible to stop the a-pawn. Obviously not a2. That would be a huge mistake, because in this position then the king would head into the corner, and that's just a draw. So king c2 first, and now the a-pawn goes home. Absolutely brilliant endgame from Adhiban. And that will go into the book of good bishop against bad knight endgames. Superb. That win brings Adhiban to 5.5 out of 6, and he now shares the lead with Martin Kravtsev after 6 rounds.